God restrains evil every single day. I live in a major city, fifth largest city in the United States. I hear gunshots all the time. Just last year, I remember a situation where it was one morning, my kids and grandkids were getting in a vehicle, and I heard bam, 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 5 shots in quick succession coming from a certain corner about, I don't know, a third of a mile away, something like that. And I stood there in my driveway and said, somebody just died. Somebody just died. And I was right. Somebody just died. Now, we as believers believe that our times are in God's hands. That means God has restrained the evil of many men. If you've ever made it home in your car, God restrained the evil of people. And even if you didn't, you got into a car accident. I think of just an awesome family in our church that last year, some idiot plowed into them. And you go, well, which one is it? God had a purpose in the one, and he has to restrain evil when there would be no purpose in the every single day on your way home situation. God is working all of that. And the Molinism says, oh yeah, we agree with that, because God is working all the little details. But he's working all the little details not based upon his freedom and his self-glorification, but he's got this middle knowledge, and he can't change it, and it doesn't come from his will, and he's working with that to try to get to an end. That's the difference between us. But if God restrains evil in the Molinist system, why? Why not just put people in the situations where they would not do those things? Or is he just stuck with it? I mean, the purpose of evil is every theistic system has to deal with it. Theodicy is an aspect of every single theistic system. You have to explain why evil exists. And the Molinist really doesn't seem to have an answer to this at all. Because the Molinist is saying God knows what any of his creatures are going to do in any given situation. And so and then I got criticized for actualizes. That's what you're supposed to say. Actualize. Didn't change the meaning whatsoever, but there was a lot of that kind of stuff in this particular response. Actualizes a world where all those horrific acts that took place when the Japanese invaded China in the late 1930s. Man, the stuff that took place then. There's a book called The Rape of Nanking. It's hard to read. It's so hard to read, the author committed suicide. I didn't realize when I read it. But the author later committed suicide. It was just so dark, the study that had been done. Why does that evil exist? As a Reformed person, God is going to demonstrate his truth and his glory in all of that on the last day. But if that exists simply because to actualize some world on the basis of some algorithm, what God's trying to accomplish, which somehow he hasn't told us about in his word. Isn't that amazing? God has told us in his word what he's doing. He's talking about his glory. But in Molinism, we don't know. Is it maximum number of people saved, minimum number of evil acts? But why did all that happen? Why did God providentially put all of those people, both the aggressors, the Japanese, and the victims, the Chinese, Why did he put them in those situations to do those things? I don't know. I don't know. In Reformed theology, God's decree, which encompasses all things, will result in his glorification. But in Molinism, that decree is delimited by what man does. And God just works with it as best he can. That was the best he could do. Those are some of the questions. I stopped this one in the middle, sorry.
What do you think?
Yeah, so let's take what White has said here and ask if this is the Molinist position. He says that according to Molinism, mankind creates, or he says that mankind makes decisions separate from the influences of God upon his life.
And what did I mean by that? What was I saying? I wasn't saying that mankind makes decisions. I was saying that the content of the decisions that mankind would make in the conditional subjunctives is not determined by God's decree. That was the context. I'm talking about that mythical stuff that is the very essence of middle knowledge and Molinism. That's what I was talking about. Let's see if they're accurate.
Does the Molinist make that claim? Of course not.
Yeah.
The content of middle knowledge does not include the actual decisions that mankind makes.
This is called playing games. And I recognize the difference. He's saying the actual decisions are not included. It's the subjunctive. It's the would, not the did or will. I get that. But that's not what I was talking about, was it? No, it wasn't.
It includes the decisions they would make were God to create them. Actual decisions are part of God's free knowledge. Subjunctive conditional decisions are part of God's middle knowledge and do not require the existence of creatures. So again, White is demonstrating that he just doesn't understand the very basics of Molinism.
The very basics. He's so dumb. Actually, Tyson just wasn't listening. So listen to that again and just think about what this means.
Subjunctive conditional decisions are part of God's middle knowledge and do not require the existence of creatures.
Think about that just for a moment. So, middle knowledge does not require... Okay, so that's what they're saying because it pre-exists the decree to create, right? And yet, the point is, from any meaningful biblical perspective, what any creature would do is dependent upon how God creates them, which is the decree. And so they want to somehow turn into a hypothetical knowledge, not based upon the and here's where the problem is, the expression of God's kind intention in the creation of all things, in his act of predestining all things, that eudokia, once again. The decree is not this empty little thing as it is in Molinism, where having run all the algorithms and come out with the final decision based on middle knowledge, now the decree is just sort of like going, start. No, the decree is the rich expression of all of the fullness of God's intention in his self-glorification. It's so much more than this decrepit Jesuit philosophical system could ever begin to understand or ever express. But he doesn't understand even the basics. Well, okay. All right.
The kettle, whatever. Anyway, White continued at 59:15 and said, the only way we can love God is if he changes our hearts. That doesn't fit into a philosophical syllogism. Is that true?
Actually, it does fit into a logical syllogism. You can put just about anything into a logical syllogism. So here's a logical syllogism. Number one, premise 1, if God doesn't change our hearts, then we cannot love him. Premise 2, we can love him. Premise 3, therefore God changes our hearts.
There you go.
This is a valid.
Now, I just have to ask, within Molinism, which is a synergistic system at its core, if you change the heart, now remember, we spent all this time in Psalm 33 because it talks about God forming the hearts of man. There was clear, sovereign expression of God's activity in regards to the very decision-making element of man, which ostensibly God can't touch because middle knowledge is based upon what that heart would do in any given circumstance. So again, this is what happens when you create something out here, try to cram it on Scripture, and you end up having to change the parameters of Scripture. That's why it's an unbiblical system. It does not derive from Scripture. If you read Psalm 33, you're not going to come up with Molinism. So that's where that okay.
Therefore, God changes our hearts.
There you go.
This is a valid deductive syllogism of the form modus tollens, and it's perhaps even a sound one. So, but what follows from the conclusion?
Yeah.
All that really follows is that God changes our hearts. It doesn't necessarily follow, though, that the way he changes our hearts is via exhaustive divine causal determinism. So the question is causal determinism necessary for changing our hearts? And I don't think so.
See, I don't even know what they think. I mean, it's obvious causal determinism for them is some type of a philosophical concept. It's God freely doing what he wishes with his creatures to his own glory for his own purposes. And he is not limited by their overriding precedence in their decisions based upon middle knowledge. And again, how can God change hearts? How does that fit in Molinism? Playing these little games here, saying, well, it doesn't require EDD. No, but it does require that God has the freedom to change the hearts of man. And yet your system says that the content of middle knowledge of what people would do in any given circumstance does not flow from God's will. But if he changes my heart so that I do what is good in his sight, did that not flow from his will? So that's why I say the anthropology of Molinism is Molina's. It's not a biblical anthropology. That is good to come up here. I know that is here.
And I've given this analogy in a prior video, and a lot of people said they really like this analogy. So I'm going to give it again. So I don't think that causal determinism is necessary for me to change my 6-year-old daughter from a non-bike rider to a bike rider.
And then he goes on from there, just demonstrating that, again, sadly, causing a rebel sinner who hates God to become a lover of God is not the same thing as teaching your daughter to ride a bike. And if you think it is, you have not even started to think about these things seriously. That's really all there is to that.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that White claims that saying determinism is the same as forcing people to do stuff is a straw man. He's the one saying that our claim that determinism is forcing people to do stuff, he says that's a straw man.
It is.
But is it?
Yes.
Well, to me, it just seems to follow by definition, right? On determinism.
Yeah, they get to make up all the definitions they want, don't they?
God is literally causing people to will, to choose, and to do everything.
Yeah.
How is that not the same as forcing them to will and to choose and to do?
So again, since they will not allow the biblical evidence to determine their parameters, then you're stuck with just all that philosophy can give you. You don't have a biblical view of man. And so man just becomes this thing that you're forcing him to do these things. If there is any divine decree that includes the actual actions of man, where that decree itself is not delimited by man's freedom. So that's the difference between, they say we both believe in God's decree. No, we do not. I believe in a decree that flows forth from God's freedom. You believe in a decree that is delimited by creaturely actions, not creaturely actions in time, but what creatures would do in whatever circumstances. You can't tell me where that knowledge comes from. That is, to me, why there's really no sense in wasting a lot of time on this in the future. But that's the difference between the two. We are using the same words. We do not mean the same thing by them. And I think most people can recognize the vast difference between a decree where God is expressing his freedom to his final glory, and when God is giving a decree where he's doing the best he can given the cards he's been dealt. Those are not the same things. Those are not the same things in any way, shape, or form.
No, we're talking about upholding the perfect righteousness of God and the responsibility of man for his sin. We're talking about demonstrating how the God revealed in nature and scripture can be rightfully said to be holy. And White thinks that we're just playing logical games and solving little philosophical quandaries, right? People's faith has been shipwrecked by the inconsistency that exists between White's determinism that's shared by many pastors around the world and the love and moral perfection of the God revealed in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I truly pity people who struggle under the mental strain caused by this cognitive dissonance that's needed to maintain that God moves his creatures to choose and do evil, and that somehow God is not the author of evil.
Yeah.
So there really is the issue. There really is the issue. This is the purpose. This was Molina's purpose. This was the purpose of the Jesuits. It was an anti-gospel purpose. It was a mechanism to do away with the powerful message of the scriptures that salvation does not come through a sacramental system and through man's free will actions in obtaining bits and drabs and dribbles of God's grace, the sacraments of Rome, but that God as sovereign over all things. Remember the first written debate of the Reformation. These guys would not be on Luther's side, okay? The first written debate of the Reformation, Erasmus, Luther, freedom and bondage of the will, the very focus of what all that was about. And so this is what they detest, is the absolute freedom of God to save as he wills. Because they'll talk about, again, the decree. You bet. But what God gets to be free to choose is not predestination and election.
On determinism, God isn't restraining creatures. He's restraining himself from making those creatures do things.
Right.
And this is exactly why I think Psalm 33 cannot be used as a proof text against libertarian free will. It makes an absolute mockery of the idea that both man and God genuinely make plans.
Right. That's
So that's a false definition of determinism. God is not restraining himself. Man is a fallen creature, found of all sorts of evil that God does not allow him to express, for which we should be greatly thankful. The whole idea that man is just this empty thing that God's pouring evil thoughts into and stuff like that is a laughably childish understanding of God's creation in time and the interaction of human beings with one another in time. We've gone over this over and over again. If they're just going to continue repeating the same thing, there's no reason to have any discussion about it. But it is a straw man, and we recognize it for what it is.